Well, thanks everybody for coming, and I'm going to speak for maybe about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for question and answer and break up in small groups and so forth. So I assume that everyone here is upset by the state of the world today. We have every right to be angry. We live in a world where 85 people own as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. That's 3.5 billion people. We live in a world where billions live on $1 or $2 a day, and 30 million children die of starvation and malnutrition every year, where clean water is an unobtainable luxury for billions, while the grasping 1% sit on trillions of dollars in unused cash, where Boeing has stolen the pensions of, yesterday it was 30,000 workers, as of today it's 100,000 workers, at the same time as it has so much profit that it bought back $10 billion worth of its own stock, where our bus system struggles for years to find $75 million to keep service intact, while the lapdogs in the legislature of both major parties fall all over themselves to grant Boeing $8.7 billion in tax breaks in a matter of days. $8.7 billion, coincidentally, being the exact amount of the recent cut in the SNAP food stamp program, where the most essential and hardest working people, those who pick our crops, care for our children, sweep our floors, serve our food, clean our bathrooms, and care for our elderly, are paid the lowest wages, while those who speculate in stocks, make real estate deals, and bankrupt our economy take lavish incomes that would make the robber barons and the crowned heads of Europe of previous age blush and shame, where those who contribute the most get paid the least, and those who contribute the least take the most, where the richest nation in the world has the highest incarceration rate in world history, where black and Latino men can be expected to be stopped by police just because of their race, where there are more black men in prison today than there were slaves in the plantations of 1850, where capital is free to move anywhere it wants, and people are controlled, restricted, and jailed for trying to cross those imaginary lines on the map that we call national borders, where women are treated like sex objects to make a profit and are denied basic reproductive justice and freedom, where the LGBTQ people are bashed, fired, and generally discriminated against just for their sexual orientation and gender identity. Where imperialist rivalry, including the prospects of war, are ever present, as the crisis in Ukraine shows us today. Where most fundamentally, the 1% are willing to risk the destruction of the planet just to milk out the last dime of profit from fossil fuels, in a world where clean energy is abundant and we now have the technology to produce it. As historian Howard Zinn put it, the wrong people are in prison and the wrong people are free. Capitalism has always been exploitive and oppressive. It has always threatened humanity. As German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg said 100 years ago, we face a choice of socialism or barbarism. In the light of the climate crisis and other capitalist-induced environmental crises, we can say the choice today is socialism or the threat of extinction. In the words of the global justice movement, another world is possible, and now we can add another system is necessary if we are to survive. Everyone in this room can come up with a long list of the horrors of capitalism. My talk tonight will contend that these horrors flow not from human nature or from greed or even the greed of the 1%, but from the economic system itself. I contend that we need to fight not just the evils of capitalism, but the system itself. And I'll try to explain why we need to replace it with socialism.
Steve, could we crank the volume up just a little bit?
Oh, am I not close enough? Is that better?
Let me see if I can crank this up a little. You're a much taller man than me. There you go.
Okay, there we go. That better?
Yeah, sing in there. You'll be fine.
Okay. Okay. We all understand that capitalism, as currently constituted, is a threat to human life. But couldn't there be a kinder, gentler capitalism? Of course, throughout history, people have built mass movements that challenged even changed aspects of capitalism. The Civil Rights Movement ended Jim Crow segregation in the South. Women in the U.S. briefly won abortion rights and legal equal pay, although real equal pay is still a long way off. Workers have won the right to have unions and better pay, Social Security, unemployment compensation. We even have a Clean Air Act and a Clean Water Act, which is supposed to protect the environment. So why can't we just keep this up and gradually turn capitalism into its opposite? There are two problems with this approach, which is called reformism or social democracy. The government under capitalism, whether in military dictatorship or a formal democracy like we have in the United States, is dominated by capitalist interests. Each government and governmental apparatus has to compete in the world with every other one. In order to control their territory, they need a strong military apparatus. To build a strong military, they need a strong economy. In a capitalist world economy, this means that each government must favor capitalist interests. That is the exploitation of workers and dividing workers against each other by using oppression. The reality of the world competitive capitalist system is supplemented by many other measures by which the capitalist class rules the political system. It uses its position as the economically dominant class to become the political ruling class. These include bribery, campaign contributions, using economic power to bend legislatures to their will, etc. A good example of this is the recent Boeing debacle in the state of Washington, where Boeing got all these tax concessions from both political parties. Overturning Citizens United would be a good step, but it would still leave the basic pro-capitalist bias of the government intact, because the pro-capitalist bias of the government is true all over the world and not just in the United States. Because of this dynamic, even when mass movements win reforms from the government, the capitalist class and its governments take back those reforms whenever the mass movement recedes. We see this today. The gains of the 30s and the 60s are either under attack or have already been rolled back. Welfare, unemployment compensation, Social Security, affirmative action, etc. Since the Great Recession started in 2007, austerity has ripped through every level of government at the state, local, and national level around the world. Whether these governments are called social democratic or even open capitalist governments like the United States. Nearly 100 years of social democratic governments in Europe have not changed the fundamental drives of capitalism. Even the most solid social democratic states in Scandinavia are cutting their social programs in the face of the world economic crisis. But there's an even deeper reality to capitalism. It is a fundamentally competitive system. Each corporation must maximize its profit in order to survive. It has to have as much money as possible to buy the most modern machinery possible, to sell its goods as cheaply as possible. To do this, it has to cut corners on the environment, pay workers as little as possible. The wealth of capitalism is accumulated by exploiting workers. Workers are not paid the full value of what they produce. Their unpaid labor is accumulated as profit. No laws or other changes in capitalism can alter this fundamental dynamic. It can be reformed on the surface, but it cannot be reformed in a fundamental way. As the old saying goes, you can peel an onion layer by layer. You cannot declaw a live tiger claw by claw. Capitalism is a tiger, not an onion. So if it will take a revolution to get rid of capitalism, what kind of revolution would that be? Marx examined capitalism and saw that workers were the class that was exploited and on whom capitalism relied for its profits. Workers had the power to cut off profits and bring the system to its knees. Workers not only had the power to overthrow capitalism, but they had the interest in doing so. Capitalism rests fundamentally on exploitation and cannot exist without it. However, it also relies on the oppression of all workers. Workers in general are oppressed. They are told what to do by their exploiters and their agents the whole workday. They are denied the right to democratically control their lives. Their choices as consumers are limited by the capitalist need for profit. They are alienated from their work lives and from each other. Capitalism sees people as means to an end and treats people as such. This then spreads over to alienated human relations throughout the whole society. Besides this, workers who are especially oppressed, as women, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ workers, etc., are treated as less than full human beings based on these characteristics. All told, a vast majority of workers are not only oppressed in general, but are especially oppressed as well. This gives workers both a fundamental power and interest in overthrowing capitalism. Of course, this is countered by the power of the capitalists over the means of mental production. the media, etc. It takes struggle and organization for workers to overcome capitalist conditioning. But over and over again, workers have risen up and overthrown or nearly overthrown the system. A short list of examples include Germany, 1918 to 23, China, 1925 to 1927, Spain, 1936, East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, France, 1968, Chile, 1971 to 3, Portugal, 1974, Iran, 1979, Poland, 1980, Philippines, 1986, and of course, the Arab Spring starting in 2011 and continuing today. In Russia in 1917, the revolution went further and actually got rid of the old governmental apparatus and created a workers' government and began to move towards socialism for a few years before the counter-revolution, which was led by Stalin. So what was Marx's alternative to capitalism? Marx looked at the history of working-class revolutions and came to some conclusions. When workers were organized and conscious enough, they would eliminate the capitalist governmental structure and replace it with a worker state, democratically controlled by the vast majority. Once workers took revolutionary political power, they would use that power to transform the economy, to take collective ownership and control over it. This would need ultimately to happen on an international scale to get rid of the competition between states. Everything couldn't happen at once, but workers would take control of the economy and shift its fundamental drive to human needs instead of profit over time. The market and competition would be replaced by democratic planning, public ownership, and workers' control. Of course, one of the most fundamental human needs is the need for a healthy environment. This would mean a rapid shift away from fossil fuels and nuclear power to clean energy. To be sure that the unity of the working class was not broken up, the workers' government would need to take radical and immediate steps to dismantle institutional racism, sexism, etc. Over time, as the economy developed, more and more abundance increased, money would lose its significance, importance, and finally disappear, along with class divisions. The work week would be cut drastically as the waste activities of capitalism, banking, real estate, stock market speculation, advertising, arms production, etc. are eliminated. Finally, in what Marx called the higher stage of communism, the guiding principle of society would become from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Leisure would increase. Then people would be able to develop themselves in an all-round way. As Marx put it, the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Or as John Lennon described communism in Imagine, one of my favorite songs of all time, imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. Imagine all the people living life in peace. This vision has nothing in common with what has often been called socialist or communist countries. Russia under Stalin, China under Mao, Cuba under the Castros. Marx's vision was fundamentally democratic. The key was to remake the relations of production, workers' democracy at work and throughout society. This would only happen if the workers did it themselves. This is why Marx called socialism the self-emancipation of the working class. In the so-called socialist and communist societies, a new ruling class exploited the workers in order to compete with the other capitalist states. They built up military power and developed the economy to accumulate and have the basis for a strong military. Stalin started the process by leading a counter-revolution against the workers' government in Russia in the 1920s. The later so-called communist societies were modeled on Stalin's. In all of these states, not only exploitation but oppression as well returned. A literary version of the overthrow of workers' power and its replacement by Stalinism is laid out in George Orwell's Animal Farm. For the reasons outlined before, social democratic parties have only modified capitalism. Now they have abandoned even the nominal goal of socialism, and they have largely adopted neoliberal policies. But is Marx's vision possible? It is for two reasons. Capitalism developed the technology to provide a society of abundance. With new technology that can provide clean energy, new organic farming techniques, etc., we could provide a decent living standard to everyone in the world without destroying the earth. The other basic force for socialism is the working class itself. It is the first class that produces collectively on a large scale and has the potential to provide for everyone. The working class has continually shown its potential to transform the system. Besides numerous examples of actual working class revolution that I just mentioned, history is full of the historic struggles against exploitation and oppression. Early strikes and union movements, the anti-globalization movements, starting in Chiapas in 1994, and then in Seattle in 1999, the Occupy movement 2 years ago, and finally the massive anti-austerity movements sweeping the world today. Bosnia, Greece, Spain, most of Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. If workers' revolutions can lay the basis for a post-capitalist society, how can we here today contribute to that process? As noted before, workers have made several attempts at socialist revolution over the last 150 years. In the earliest attempts, capitalism wasn't developed enough to sustain a society of abundance. After Russia, the other revolutions never succeeded in getting rid of the old capitalist governmental apparatus and replacing it with a workers' democracy. The main reason they failed was the lack of a large enough revolutionary organization that could lead the process. The capitalists are highly organized and have all the physical and mental means of production at their disposal. To defeat them, workers too have to be highly organized. The socialist revolution cannot be willed into existence. Capitalism is a crisis-ridden system. A deep economic and social crisis will create a situation where, as Lenin put it, the ruling class can no longer rule in the old way, and the oppressed classes are no longer willing to be ruled in the old way. When this happens, the question will be, are workers well enough organized to carry through and take power? To be sure that workers will be ready, we need to contribute as much as possible to building socialist organization today. This is necessary not just to be sure we are organized when the revolutionary crisis comes, but also because a clear understanding of our goals can help to provide the best strategies and tactics and movements today. For example, in the movements of today, Marxists argue for no support to either major political party, mass struggle as opposed to terrorism or supporting politicians, the need to fight oppression now to unify the working class, support for all workers' struggles against exploitation, rejection of any support to imperialism, and support for self-determination of nations. And finally, founding all these movements on democratic principles, making sure that the people involved in them democratically control those movements. To contribute the most to bringing about a socialist transformation, socialists do three things. Participate in and build as much as possible any struggle against the evils of capitalism today. Learn from other activists they work with, and finally lay the basis for a revolutionary party by building socialist organization. The three are directly related. Revolutionary organization can help movements be more successful, and increasing movements against capitalism can create more conscious revolutionaries. So where does that leave the people in this room tonight? I would like to make three recommendations. First of all, continue and intensify the work that I know most people in this room are already doing in the movements that they're involved in. Secondly, seriously consider Marxism, revolutionary socialism, as an alternative to capitalism. Consider Marxism as a fulfillment of the progressive struggles against oppression, exploitation, war, and environmental destruction. Look into Marxism, read about it, talk to Marxists about it. And finally, if you decide that Marxism is the best way to transform the world in a healthy direction, seriously consider joining a Marxist organization. Do an investigation of the politics of the various groups that exist with a view to joining one. That's it. Okay, questions, comments, all that kind of good stuff. Well, there are many different socialist groups, and there's one group called the Socialist Party, which runs candidates, but there's a lot of other groups, and the ISO is one of those. And we come from this tradition that we're talking about against Stalinism, for real grassroots working class democracy, internationalism, and so forth. In Seattle, we're involved in several different things. We're involved in the 15 Now campaign, the Seattle Education Association, where we have some members who are running, who are actively involved in C, which is Social Equality Educators, which are trying to make the union more anti-racist and taking up social issues more. We're involved in the Seattle Clinic Defense, which defends reproductive justice, reproductive freedom for women. The No New Jim Crow campaign, which fights against racial injustice and mass incarceration. And we're also involved in a lot of union activity as well. So, yeah, basically, there has never been such a thing as pure, that is free market capitalism, like Milton Friedman writes about, or things like that, where everything is the market. Capitalism was created in some ways, in England anyway. There was a royal government which kicked peasants off the land and created a working class, which then allowed the rising capitalist class to employ workers in their factories and so forth. So it's never been a situation where we had a free market economy with very little government involvement and all that kind of stuff. That's a myth of the libertarians and people who support Milton Friedman's ideas and things like that. So what we have today is capitalism in the sense that it's dominated by capital. It's dominated by the drive for profit. It's a competitive system. And even if you had this kind of capitalist utopia where everybody had a small business and the government didn't interfere, the way capitalism develops, over time, concentration takes place. Businesses are driven out of business and they get bigger and so forth. And pretty soon you have monopolies that run things. And capitalists do not operate on principle. They operate on profit. So they're not going to go, oh, I'm a good libertarian, therefore I'm against the government being involved in the economy. No, they're going to go and bribe officials and get tax breaks and get good regulations and do all this kind of stuff. And they will always use the government for their own ends, no matter what. And so you can never have a situation where you have a pure free market economy where the government doesn't really interfere, because as soon as people get concentrations of wealth, they're going to go to the government and use the government to further their concentrations of wealth. So that's the way it's always going to be. So we live today very much in a capitalist society, I think. Wow, that's the major question of the day, isn't it? How do we do that? I think part of it is the main thing is that capitalism is doing it for us. They're educating people about capitalism. And so you have a situation where, 50 years ago or something like that, everybody was for capitalism in the United States, or almost everybody. Today, I think after the Great Recession, we found that among people under 30, almost as many supported socialism as supported capitalism in an opinion poll by the Rasmussen Group. And there's been other polls since then that have replicated the same thing. Even among the general population, 20% of the US population supported socialism over capitalism. And you got to remember that the United States is still the dominant world imperialist power, the richest country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And it's hard to kind of break through that. But I think the more reality people see, the more questioning they are of the system. So you have the Occupy movement, where we are the 99% became very, very popular, not just among people who are occupying, but all over the country. And so I think it's partly the process of capitalism educating people, and then partly the process of us organizing and fighting back. And when we organize and fight back, we begin to challenge our ideas, the ideas that we've been taught. And so that's a process, because I mean, there's different pressures going on all the time. There's the media, there's the politicians, think of what happened to the Boeing workers. What was good for the Boeing workers was to reject that contract, at least in my view, and in the view of a lot of Boeing workers, 49% of them the last time. But the media kept barraging and barraging, and the politicians and all this kind of stuff. Oh, you're gonna kill everything. You're gonna lose all your jobs, etc. Or the other thing today that we're dealing with the 15 Now movement. Oh, you can't raise people's wages to $15 an hour. That's going to kill jobs, right? So it's these kind of ideological onslaughts that are going to go on to make people think that they have to be, quote, practical about things and live within the confines of the capitalist system. So it's going to take organizing, I think, struggles, but also trying to counter that ideology in an organized way, putting out the socialist case, et cetera, trying to educate people as much as possible. And the combination of those three things, I think, make it possible to break through that. But it's a hard job. It's not going to be easy. Just look at this society. We have, in this area, we have two of the richest people in the whole world. maybe 3. Maybe I'm missing somebody. Okay, we got Paul Allen, Bill Gates. We probably got Bezos. Okay, yeah, we got a lot of these people, right? And they have so much money that they could not spend it if they tried in many lifetimes, and they don't really know what to do with it, right? And so they decided, the people who run things decided that we should have a tunnel through downtown Seattle, right? For, what is it, billions of dollars that's going to cost? 4 billion? Yep. 11. Okay, whatever. It's going to be a hell of a lot of money, right? And now they're saying people can't get $15 an hour because the nonprofits in Seattle, if you read this Seattle Times article that came out recently, would have to come up with $11 million. $11 million? And they're wasting several billion dollars to build a tunnel through downtown Seattle, which probably won't even ever get built. Or if it does, it'll make things worse. And as soon as somebody wants to have a new stadium, if they have money, they'll buy election after election until they get it, and they'll get the taxpayers to subsidize their stadium. So the money is there. Why do we have to stay within these confines of, well, small businesses might go out of business if we raise the... No, let's have a radical approach. And this is way short of socialism, okay? I'm not saying we need a socialist revolution right now. We need it, but we're not going to get it right now. But even way short of that, let's take a more radical approach to these things, right? Let's look at where the wealth is and get at least, all we're asking for is a little bit of that. How much would it cost to pay people in this city $15 an hour? It wouldn't be anywhere near what they're spending on a lot of this stuff, which is a waste anyway. So that's the way I look at it. But yeah, we live in what's known as a bourgeois democracy or a capitalist democracy. That is, we have elections, we have, a certain amount of political freedom and that kind of thing. But the people who really run things are the 1%. So I mean, and they've told us this. You may have heard the quote from Woodrow Wilson from way back in the early 1900s. He said, yeah, if you come to Washington and want to talk to your representatives, they'll politely listen to you. But when they want to make decisions and they really want to hear what people have to say, they listen to the bankers and they listen to the big corporate leaders and this kind of stuff. And that's the way it is. So it's run by and for the large concentrations of wealth. And the thing about socialist democracy is the only way. What we're talking about is ending exploitation, that is making sure that people get the full value of what they produce and that we generalize and plan and organize that kind of a system. And the only way you can do that is democratically. If you have a few people at the top running things again, like under Stalin's Russia or whatever, then they're going to feather their own nest. They're going to be the ones who are the new 1%, who take the wealth. So the only way you can really have a fair distribution of wealth and using it for human needs is if people are really in control of it democratically. And so socialism and democracy, a real, Marxism and the Marxist view have to go together. If you don't have one, you can't have you have to have them both together. Yeah. I think it's similar to the incentive system when you live in a communal household with a whole bunch of people and somebody's got to clean the bathroom, right? It's like nobody wants to do it, but it's got to get done, so you rotate it, you figure it out, you do whatever. So it's that kind of thing. I think if we had really unpleasant jobs, we would kind of share it out and not have a situation where somebody was doing horrible work for 40 hours a week and somebody else was doing very pleasant work for 40 hours a week. But how it would be worked out would have to be democratically decided, I think. I think that a big part of it is moral or spiritual or whatever you want to call it. It's like you want to live in people generally want to live in a decent society. It's even though we've been trained in a certain way, in a very competitive way, I think for a lot of people, or I would dare say most people, it is kind of sickening and offensive when you see homeless people in the street. When you see racism, when you see sexism, when you see those kind of things, it just kind of makes you sick, right? And you want to live in a society where you can get along with people, where people care about each other, all of those kind of things. So that's part of what the whole struggle is about. I think it's about redistributing the wealth, or taking over the wealth and using it, but it's not really so much about wealth. It's about creating a society where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So where people can fully develop all of their human potential. And that's the kind of society that Marx envisioned, that's really part of the goal of a socialist revolution. So the fight against exploitation is the root of it and is important and has to be done in order to create a kind of a society where all of these other things are possible. So I don't know. Right, that's why the abolition of money is a very important part of the process. The problem is when you have a socialist revolution immediately, you can't just snap your fingers and get rid of money, because there's a rationing system and that kind of thing. You have to get up to full levels of production where people can, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, is possible when you develop things. But at that point, you can get rid of money, and you need to, because to get religious on you, the love of money is the root of all evil. Yeah, just real quick quote from Marx that expresses this. We need a revolution for two reasons. One, because the ruling class will not give up its wealth and power without one. And secondly, because only through the struggle can people change themselves to become fit to rule, is the way you put it. And so that's the process that we was just talking about getting rid of racism, getting rid of sexism, pro-imperialist attitudes, et cetera, learning to cooperate with each other, all of those kind of things, so we remake ourselves in the struggle. So let's see. Yeah, in the back? No. At least not in my view. I mean, that's a debate, that's a long debate and long discussion. I think that history shows that the people who have the wealth and power will never give it up without a fight. But if they suddenly have a moral transformation, that would be wonderful, and I'd be in favor of a total nonviolent revolution. But I don't foresee that happening. But one thing, I think, if we look at the Russian Revolution, where they were most organized in St. Petersburg, it was an armed revolution for sure, but the worker side was so well armed and so well organized that there was almost no bloodshed in the capital city when they took over. So there's a difference between a violent, in the sense of bloody revolution on the one hand and an armed revolution on the other. I mean, sometimes they're the same, but they don't always have to be. And in the case of the Russian Revolution, they weren't. So I think what that tells us is that we have to be well armed and prepared. Otherwise, there will be a lot of bloodshed. If we just walk out in the street, and say, we're going to take over now, if they got the machine guns, they're still going to use them. But one of the key things about the Russian Revolution and other revolutions has been that the rank and file of the military, or at least big sections of it, have been won over to the side of the revolution. And when they come over to the side of the revolution, they bring their weapons with them. And so that's an important part of the process. If we just have a revolution where it's the civilians against the military, we're going to lose. So we're going to have to win over sections of the military. And that's always been the case in every single successful revolution. And then I think that we all know about this, but I'll just throw this in. I think it's important to understand that capitalism is a very violent system on a daily basis. People are starved to death, et cetera. People are homeless and dying in the street, all of these kind of things. So it's not a question of, well, we don't have violence now, and now, oh, do we want a violent revolution? It's like, if you don't have a revolution, you're going to have the continual capitalist violence all the time, and more people are going to die. And the way things are going, maybe civilization will collapse, with the global warming, et cetera. So I could just give a very, very capsule, and then I really invite people to do their own research, and glad to talk to you about the ISO. There's other people, Dan is in Socialist Alternative, other people are willing, I'm sure would be glad to talk to you about this. But basically, kind of what I laid out is, our view is socialism from below, that is ordinary working class people taking control, workers' democracy, and on the other side, what's known as socialism from above, in a sense, is social democracy and Stalinism, where social democracy believes that you can elect people up here and they can take care of things, just pass some good laws. On the other hand, the Stalinist movement believed that you can nationalize everything under a government that's run from the top by a small group of people, and that'll take care of everything. Either way, it's a top-down approach, and instead what we really need is a bottom-up grassroots approach. So that's the tradition that the ISO stands in. There are some groups in Seattle that are in the Stalinist tradition. The main, I'd say, social democratic group in the United States is the Democratic Socialists of America, who not only believe that capitalism can be reformed, but they also believe that the Democratic Party can be reformed. So that's kind of the, but I could certainly talk to anybody about specific groups in Seattle in more detail. Well, again, that was within the left, that was the debate. The Stalinist side said yes, socialism in one country. When Russia was isolated after 1917, Stalin came to power with a new bureaucracy which exploited everybody and so forth, and created what we call state capitalism. That is, the workers were still exploited, they were still competing with other countries and all that kind of stuff, but it was run by the state. So
I'm talking about real socialist, in your opinion, by your definition, a successful socialist revolution.
Well,
can one country survive in the world economy?
Not for a very long period of time. It would have to be spread pretty quickly. I mean, we can't expect that revolution is going to break out in every country at the same moment, but like if workers took power in one country, it would have to begin to spread to other countries, or they would be isolated just like Russia was. So that's, yeah. I think
so the other side of that question is, if everybody's socialist except for one powerful country, can socialism survive? I mean, does one bad apple, one bad powerful apple spoil the whole barrel or what?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever heard that one before. I don't know. But the point is to have a revolution in that one bad apple, because it would create problems for sure. It would make it harder to move forward all the way. Whether it would totally derail the operation, I don't know. But it definitely would be a goal to spread the revolution to that other country as well. Yeah.
I don't think we can pretend anymore that state actors like 50 years ago are as powerful as they were. The real actors in the world are multinational corporations and centralized authorities like central banks and multinationals. Those are state actors in terms of power. It's shifted in the last 50 years as capitalism has taken over the entire paradigm. So I think any discussion of can a socialist country survive needs to take that into account.
That's a real interesting point, and I think that actually that's a big debate on the left as well. There's been a lot of articles or books and so forth written on all sides of this. Just real briefly, I think that that argument has been stretched a little too far in the sense that the governmental apparatuses, the states, the military, are still needed to back up the multinational corporations. And so there's a direct connection between the corporations and the states. So, I mean, just look at what's happening today in the Ukraine, for example. I mean, so, but it is a really important discussion that people should look into. Right? Yeah.
Why is it that one country, socialists, wouldn't survive along the world economy?
Why couldn't it survive? Is that what? Well, because it would be attacked. Same what happened with Russia. It was the capitalists don't want to see a successful worker state moving towards socialism, so they invaded Russia. 17 different foreign armies invaded, including the United States, by the way, which occupied parts of Russia for a while. That's the main reason. But the other thing is, to really develop the productive forces, it has to be done on a world scale. It doesn't really work in one country. You don't have all the resources you need or all the industry you need and so forth. So it's got to be a cooperative effort on kind of a world scale as well. So that's the other side of the argument in the long run. But the immediate thing would be that the capitalists would try to economically and militarily attack that one isolated state. Well, that's a good question, and that again, that's also a long-standing debate in the left. I think I'm not against workers' co-ops. I think they're fine, but I don't see them as a way to actually transform the system, because basically what happens with workers' co-ops is they become subsumed in the capitalist system and they have to compete. They have to exploit themselves. The drives of capitalism continue. It's like in some ways like any other small business, right? They have to cut their costs, they have to compete, they have to do all those kind of things. So the idea of using that as a springboard I don't think really works. Most co-ops end up going back to the capitalist form after a while. So there were, yeah.
I mean, so is your conclusion that you have to wait for Jesus? I mean, that's what the church ran into, is we couldn't wait any longer. We had to start practicing.
Well, there's a debate over Jesus too. Was he a communist or not? A lot of people think he was. All right, there we go. But no, we don't have to wait. We need to struggle right now, like the things like 15 Now, or the fight against mass incarceration, or labor struggles. All of those kind of things to build up, to win gains right now, but also to build up the forces on our side. So it isn't a matter of waiting or not waiting. It's a matter of doing both at the same time, I think. Yeah. We have a contact, ISO has a contact list back here if you'd like to find out more and so forth, and take a look at the literature table. And again, the next meeting next Tuesday will be on the rent's too damn high, and encourage people to come to that. And thank you very much. It's been a good discussion.